All right, hello and welcome everybody to another episode of The Big Three on CPA TV. My name is Mihir Torsekar, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host and fellow economist at CPA, Andrew Rechenberg, and together we're both going to talk to you about the big three events happening in trade that are happening this week. So let's get to it. All right, so Andrew, first up, we've got finally, after so much debate and discussion and speculation, we finally got a ruling on the IEEPA tariffs. The federal court has struck them down again. And, we've talked about the implications of this, what might happen on our podcast before. We had Chuck Benoit, our legal trade counsel expert, on to talk about the possible, implications. You and I talked about it the following week after Chuck was on. So we know, I think where it stands now, the administration is going to appeal the ruling. It's going to go to the Supreme Court. What do you make of all this? Where do you think we sit on all of this?
Yeah, I think it's important to emphasize that this isn't over yet, that the administration's almost certainly going to appeal this to the Supreme Court, and the court has allowed the tariffs to stay in place until at least October 14th while this happens. And so the tariffs aren't gone by any means yet, but it's looking worse and worse for the legality of these IEEPA tariffs. It's looking more than likely that they're going to be significantly rolled back in some way by the Supreme Court, even if it's not totally gone. But this power is going to be severely curbed at the least. And so it really makes it important that Congress needs to step up here and solidify these gains. We have billions and billions of tariff revenue at stake. We have a lot of protection that's encouraged investment here in the U.S. for our manufacturers. And this uncertainty of tariffs coming and going is going to be really bad for these investments and this business confidence to come into the U.S. and make these multi-year investments in U.S. manufacturing. And Congress needs to get on board to see this early success of the tariffs, of all these investment announcements, and really make sure that not only the revenue happens, but make sure that we make these investments in the U.S. worthwhile over the long term. And so a lot's at stake here. And I think the number one thing that we can do about it is supporting the Secure Trade Act, which will, very first thing, introduce a 10% universal tariff, along with a lot of other trade actions to crack down on China and really just secure our trade. So it's the very first step that Congress should do to secure this revenue and this baseline level of protection.
Yeah, I find it interesting to see how this has all played out. So over the past, roughly 9 months or so, we've seen not just the debate about tariffs, but we've seen them in action. And we've seen, some real benefits actually that have been accumulating. For example, customs has collected billions of dollars in revenue. I think that voters and other folks are beginning to see that tariffs have not translated in the kind of inflationary economic environment that was once predicted by so many so-called experts. And so as a result, I think you're starting to see a little bit of a consensus building here. So I don't necessarily think it's time to panic. In fact, what I think is most interesting to observe here is how, they call it the Overton window of how things have changed over time now. We're not just talking about tariffs. We're talking about what kind of tariffs are we going to be seeing. And the fact that you've now bought time for Congress to get on board. And you mentioned the Secure Trade Act, and that's a bipartisan legislation. As you say, 10% universal tariff, but also importantly removes most favored nation status from China, which would, I think, send their tariffs up to something like 35%, depending on the goods, anywhere from 35 to 100%, depending on the type of good that we're talking about, if it's a critical, good of national interest implications. So I think that this is a really interesting debate that we've been having. And let's not forget, we've still got the 232s in place. We've still got the 301 statutes that are, legally very defensible, very robust measures of protection. So we still have those in place. And of course, the administration has very much been pushing forward on the 232s. We've gone from, I think in the maybe last podcast or 2 podcasts ago, we were at 9 investigations. I think now we might be up to 12. So I think it's still up and going. So more to talk about that. We'll see what happens with the Supreme Court. It should be something to follow that we'll be definitely covering. The second topic of the week I wanted to talk about. So I think maybe 2 weeks ago, Canada had ended up revoking some of the retaliatory tariffs that they had applied to the United States. I thought this was interesting because by itself, it's interesting. But if you cast it in the larger context of how a lot of these experts predicted the U.S. tariffs would unfold. They said retaliation was going to be imminent, and this would just spark this massive trade war. I want you to talk a little bit about how, maybe what the implications are, what this means for Canada being another country to step back on retaliatory tariffs, and the fact that really we haven't seen this much. We haven't really seen any retaliatory tariffs. Talk a little bit about that if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, definitely. I think that what we're really seeing here is these bad economic predictions really falling apart. And so a lot of what these predictions from free trade economists end up being for saying that these tariffs could have these bad effects, it's going to be hurtful for our exporters, is relying on this notion that countries are going to retaliate in equal measure and it's going to be equally bad for our exporters as it is for other countries. And so that really isn't playing out. And I think the main reason is because big countries benefit from more closed trade and smaller countries benefit from more open trade. If you're Singapore, it's not necessarily going to be good for you to tariff everything coming in, but when you're the United States, the world's biggest economy, the world's biggest single country market, it's going to be a lot more beneficial. We have a lot more of our own domestic manufacturers, and by us implementing tariffs, it's going to be a lot more damaging for countries like Japan or China or even Canada, who rely more on exports to us than we rely on imports from them. And I think that that's exactly what we're seeing here with stuff like Canada dropping their retaliatory trade tariffs, that they're realizing that they don't have the power to hold really as much over the U.S. as we have to them, just because we're so much bigger of an economy. It's just simple math there. And we're also seeing this play out for countries like Japan. Japan has had plummeting export levels this year due to the Trump tariffs, and that's really showing that it's really being held up by U.S. imports, that all these different export countries around the world, they're all going to the world's biggest market. We're the biggest place, and we shouldn't just give that away free. We should really prioritize our own domestic manufacturers and not just let the whole world pump up all these exports into our own economy and not have any protections for our own producers.
Yeah, I mean, it really comes down to leverage at the end of the day. I mean, people want to get into our markets, and these countries that we've negotiated with have shown a willingness to do that. They're offering concessions. They're lining up to try to say whether they need to contribute to a sovereign wealth fund that we're talking about, whether it's, investing in shipbuilding. I think South Korea, for example, tossed out like $150 billion for a maritime shipbuilding fund or something to that effect. So, yeah, we are seeing this almost as a vehicle to induce some sort of investment, some other kinds of concessions. And what we're not seeing is the kind of retaliation that folks had predicted, and that has failed to materialize. So again, the experts appear to have been wrong, and we're happy to report that that has been the case. So the third item I wanted to talk about, the DOJ and the DHS have formed a trade task force to, I think, investigate some customs fraud. I wanted to hear your thoughts initially about that, what you think about it.
Yeah, I think that this is a fantastic new approach that really shows that the U.S. government and really our whole approach should be proactive rather than reactive. We should be actively seeking out any of this trade fraud. We know it happens, and rather than reacting years down the line, waiting for reports to come in, we should really be checking for these things in a proactive manner. We know it happens, and if we're just reactive with it, it'll take years of damage to actually filter through and figure out what's happening. But if we're proactive with this, we can figure out all of this trade fraud as it's happening. And so just to give a few examples on what this can include straight up tariff evasion. So just listing a different country of origin. If China has a higher tariff than Cambodia, then you might list Cambodia rather than China. We've seen this with a lot of products. It can also be misclassification of the actual HTS code. So the product listing that it's under comes with a certain HTS code, and you can just falsely list it as something else. It could be something very similar, for example, a different kind of metal pipe that has a different HTS code, or it could be something that's very blatantly wrong. It could be coming in as a drone and you list it as a t-shirt. And so there's really ridiculous examples out there. And unless we're proactively looking for this, we won't actually know when it's happening, because if you're not inspecting the containers, it'll just come in without any inspection. And so we have to really be proactive with this. Another big one is invoice fraud. So right now, a lot of the tariffs are just based on what the declared value is. So what they're saying this is worth, but they can list anything on that. It's a legal document, and you can be punished and you should be punished if you lie about that. And we should be checking for that, that if they're really undervaluing products to get a lower tariff rate just based on that total value, these are all things that we really should be looking for. And so this is a really significant new approach that DOJ and DHS is taking to be proactive with this approach. And I think we need to see a lot more of it. And we need to be looking for these things before they happen rather than trying to fix the damage 5 years down the line.
Yeah, I think it's especially important as we see that we are now increasing our, the kind of penalties that we're finally starting to fight back and impose penalties, whether it's tariffs or, anything of the sort. And as a result, we need to, as we implement these policies, we can't just have the policy and walk away. We need to make sure that we're enforcing it, because that's the other part of this whole equation. If you could have all the tariffs in the world that you want, but if countries are finding ways to circumnavigate that, if they're doing things like tariff engineering, as you mentioned, where you're essentially just making a minimal change to a product and classifying it in some other category or some other way you classify goods, and shipping it duty free or under a lower tariff rate, that defeats the whole purpose. And as you mentioned, it does compromise our ability to collect customs revenue. And as we've seen, as these 9 months have demonstrated with IEEPA tariffs, as I mentioned a little bit ago, the customs revenue that has been coming in, that's real money. Do we really want to keep that on the table? I don't think so. So yes, this is absolutely important. I do think that shows an important signal that we are going to be cracking down on this kind of behavior, and it's unacceptable, frankly. So glad to see that there's some movement going on. CPA strongly supports those measures. So I think that we've had a pretty good show for the week. I think it's probably a good place to wrap up. Look forward to meeting with you, chatting about the next big 3 issues for next week. And until then, folks, we're signing off for the week. Thank you.